I have had a lifetime involvement in the civil rights struggle, and when I realized this date was coming up, I wanted something to happen here in Brookings. I've been here 2.5 years. I love this place, and it just seemed appropriate that we have some sort of observance of a death of a remarkable man who did so much to make this country a better place. I also want to thank my good wife, Alice. 1968 was not a very good year in a lot of ways. It started with a United States Navy spy boat being captured by the North Koreans. Then came the Tet Offensive, which reminded us that that war was not winnable. And then came some terrible assassinations of Martin Luther King and of Bobby Kennedy, and the hope of a lot of us was shattered. But I did have one hopeful thing happen in that year, and that was marrying Alice. She's a very gifted musician and a good friend and partner and the love of my life. And I want to mention one thing about her right now. She recently had surgery on her lower lip for skin cancer. And this was a painful, and she's still recovering from it. And she is under strict doctor's orders not to smile. So if she seems unsmiling, the smiles, I think, will come out in the music and not be otherwise shown. But thank you so much for sharing your gifts with us today. About the service today, all of the lessons and prayers we've chosen seemingly to be very appropriate for an occasion in which we honor the life of a very remarkable man. This is the only event like this taking place in Brookings, but I found out that there are things going on throughout the country. Of course, in Memphis, where the Lorraine Motel is now the National Civil Rights Museum, where King was shot and killed. In Atlanta, where his roots are and the King Center is, and so forth. But what I didn't realize until yesterday was the National Council of Churches has, with many partners of faith, other faiths other than Christianity, have come together to have a big event on the National Mall at the Martin Luther King Monument, and to start, I've given you handouts about it, what seems to be a terribly necessary and appropriate response to the type of racism that still is very, very present in our society. So this might seem one event in a small town somewhere on the West Coast, but a lot of American people have come together in a variety of different ways to be celebrating the life of one very remarkable man. The first time I heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak was in Oakland, California in the 1950s. I'm not sure exactly what year it was. I was a high school student. I was very much involved in church youth activity, and I was someone who kind of started paying attention to the news and to what we were learning in civics about what was going on in the American South. And here I saw Martin Luther King was going to speak in Oakland, so I went to hear him. I was probably the only white person there. There were some relatively light-skinned black people, but what have you, and it was a wonderful experience for me because I'd never been in a context quite like that. The audience was responding with hallelujahs, and the songs were boisterous, and he was a spellbinding orator with remarkable gifts to project the message of his faith and to make people, all people, feel really moved by him. It was not just the intellectuals, the sophisticated, but it was everybody. And it struck me that the one thing I remembered his saying in that speech, somewhat 55, 57 years later, was that if you are a street sweeper, be the Michelangelo of street sweepers. Be someone who does such a fine job at it that people will say, now there is some seriously high quality street sweeping. And anyway, when I look back at those days, it seems appropriate to look back at what was going on in his life then. He was a very gifted young man. He had got through high school by the age of 15. He graduated from Morehouse College by the age of 19. He finished seminary at the age of 22 and was well on his way to a doctorate at Boston University at the age of 26. And at that time, he was facing what kind of ministry, what kind of life path he would set before him. And his father, his family, and many people in Atlanta had very strong ideas. Well, you come to Atlanta, you be the associate pastor of Ebenezer Lutheran Church, you be someone who involves yourself in what was a pretty sophisticated and powerful black community in this major city in the American South. He also was offered a position at Morehouse College, where he was a graduate, and he could have had a pretty comfortable life for himself. A black man in America never really has a truly comfortable life, I'm afraid, because there is a kind of fear of what happens if you're in your backyard with a cell phone and other things that remind us that justice is not common for all people in our society. But at that time, he had in his life, in his education, things going on that helped him shape who he was going to be. While in seminary, especially, he became deeply acquainted, of course, with the teachings of Jesus, but also, and this was a blessed synchronicity, with the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. There's a man who was the dean of the chapel at Boston University named Howard Thurman, who was someone who had visited India in the 1930s and had recognized that something really wonderful was happening there. The British Empire was being overcome by hordes of people acting nonviolently, but confrontationally and directly to confront injustice. And they won. And Gandhi had the discipline and the leadership ability to convince his people that if blood was to be shed, it should be their own blood. And when you think of how Gandhi had done this, and here King, who's going to the north to get pretty sophisticated theological training, is introduced not only to a lot of the Christian social gospel as it had developed, but also the teachings of Gandhi. And when it came time to take his first call as a pastor, he had a bunch of different choices. He had remarkable offerings from prominent black churches throughout the land. But there was one that stood out, and history was made because of that. It was Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, where Montgomery, of course, was the capital of the Confederacy. It was a highly racist town, terribly, terribly segregated in lots of different ways. And as we all know, those ways even included how people sat on buses. King himself had had an unusual experience relating to a bus when he was just in high school. He had gone to an oratorical conference with his teacher. He did well in the event, went back on a bus to go return to Atlanta, and at one bus stop, a couple white people got on, and he and his teacher had to stand up for the rest of the trip. He later said he was never more angry in his whole life than that particular time. But it taught him something about the injustice that was in and is in this land, and helped frame and shape the remarkable person he became. So he didn't go to Atlanta. He could have had a very comfortable life, and he had no way of really anticipating what was going to go on in Montgomery until Rosa Parks made her famous decision. She was tired after a hard day of work, that she saw no reason why she should give up her seat to a white man just because of skin color and just because of the type of prejudice that was built into the Jim Crow South. He found himself, after only being in Montgomery for a year and a half, close to 2 years, thrust into a leadership position. He could have just stayed at his church and said he was too busy for that. He could have said, I have a young family. In fact, his first child was born just around the same time as the Rosa Parks incident was taking place. He could have had a fairly simple and comfortable and normal time of life. But things changed dramatically in Montgomery after the Rosa Parks incident. And for the rest of his life, he was what some people in the church call bi-vocational. I used to be bi-vocational. I was a full-time high school teacher, but I was also a part-time pastor of a church. Well, King was bi-vocational for the rest of his life. He remained a pastor at Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, and then later at the church in Atlanta, where his father was a longtime minister, and Ebenezer. And he continued in that role and often was going back on Sundays to preach. But then the rest of his life was really crazy. He was asked to go speak. He was asked to raise money. One cause was happening in one part of the country, another cause at another part. And so much of his life, he was away from home. He was traveling. He was dealing with overwhelming issues and terrible forces that were willing to try and fight against what he represented. And at one point, not too long after he accepted the leadership position in the Montgomery Improvement Association, late at night, he got a phone call from a racist using ugly language and saying, you better get out of town in 3 days, or else we're going to blow up your house and blow up your brains. And this, of course, was unnerving. Yet, King tried to come to an idea of, how do I cope with this? The story is told that he made some coffee and wandered in his kitchen and was trying to figure out what to do. But he suddenly had what sometimes is now called the kitchen epiphany. That he said, and these are his words, I had to know God for myself, and then I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, that's his first two names, which he got when he was about 12 years old because his father changed his own name and his son's name. Stand up for righteousness. What Tim was just talking about. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. This is what religion is all about. That God is understood as calling people, as communicating with people to do something with their lives that is much bigger than who they themselves happen to be. From that moment on, he lived bravely and daily in the valley of the shadow of death. He got many death threats. He had bombs at his house. He was punched. He was stabbed. He had bricks thrown at him. He had rocks and other things. He took all sorts of verbal abuse. But his commitment to keep the eyes on the prize of a more peaceable and just society kept him going. Always, it seemed, with that lingering threat of death accompanying him every day. Imagine what that would feel like for you. But be grateful that he was willing to live by the epiphany, live by a faith that the divine was working in and through people just like him. He then had a life with a terrible balancing act. He tried to be a pastor, became the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was a fundraiser. He was a strategist. He was sophisticated in learning from what Gandhi had done in India. He was a negotiator. He was a speaker all sorts of places. He authored 4 or 5 books, and through all of that, he kept going and kept his eyes on the prize. He followed the radical demands of Jesus and the Hebrew prophets, one that we heard in the lessons today. Shalom is a Hebrew word that's often translated by the word peace, but that's a kind of unfortunate English translation because it's limited. Sometimes when we hear the word peace, we think absence of hostility or conflict. It's like a ceasefire. It's not really peace. It's just non-conflict. But his idea of peace and the idea that one finds in the great prophets of Israel, in Isaiah, in Amos, and Micah, and others, is the presence of love, agape love, the presence of community, the presence of justice, the presence of a good, fine life for everybody. This place was created with the idea that creatures would have a rich and abundant life, and yet so much of that has not happened because sometimes people just don't understand the message of their faith. If we take the Bible seriously, we learn something that the evangelical writer and activist Jim Wallace demonstrated years ago. He was starting a community in Washington, D.C. called the Sojourners, and one of the first study things he had them do was to take Bibles and look page for page where there was any reference to the poor and the needy, and to cut out those pages. And all of a sudden, the Bible was half of what it was, because the Bible is full of images that God is biased for the poor, and that if one knows love and faith, that one automatically should be concerned about the widow, the orphan, the outsider, those who are different, those who are strangers, those who are struggling, those who are disabled, those who are oriented differently in their sexuality, and all of that, that a person who responds to the message of biblical faith should be sharing that love with everyone. There's no civil rights leader that I can think of, or no preacher in the 20th century, except perhaps Dag Hammarskjöld in a very different way, who communicated with people about why they should share as a response to the love of the divine that they've experienced with all people, but especially the poor and the needy and the stranger at the gate. King was sometimes disparagingly called a black agitator. In fact, there used to be jokes going around in the old days that Whirlpool and some of the other washing machine makers started repainting the inside of washing machines so that people couldn't point out there was a black agitator in them. And thank you for laughing. He went to school with me a long, long time ago and is used to this kind of behavior on my part. The second and only other time I heard King's speech was at the March on Washington in the year 1963. It was a joyous event. There was great music. Those who performed included Marian Anderson singing "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands." Probably the greatest of the gospel singers, Mahalia Jackson, also sang. And by the way, one privilege of the life that King led was he could call up Mahalia Jackson anytime he wanted to and say, "Please sing something, I'm down. I need something to lift up my spirits." And she would do so. There was also Joan Baez. Why am I having trouble? Mary, who was it? Mary and folk singing trio. Peter, Paul, and Mary. What gang? Sorry. Anyway, there was also a whole fine group of speakers. Walter Reuther of the United Author Workers was very eloquent, and so was a Jewish rabbi who had escaped Nazi Germany. And he said that the greatest enemy he saw through that experience was people of goodwill who were silent. And that moved a lot of us to realize that we got to do something with our lives. There were about 250,000 people there, and most of us might not realize it, but probably about a fifth of us were white people who had seen the injustice in this land and wanted to join this great march for equality and jobs. It was a happy day. King stirred up the crowd, especially Mahalia Jackson told him to leave his prepared text and start telling about his dream. And we've all heard that speech many times. And one of the good things about this anniversary is right now the media is just full of documentaries and stories and video and so forth from those days. But after that, he had some troubled days. We know about the awful days in Birmingham with fire hoses and police dogs. We know of Selma, which had 3 martyrs, or 4, I guess, 2 from a Unitarian tradition. And things were getting rougher and rougher. But King persisted. He was willing to accept the platter that had been put before him, even though he again was living probably more than ever in his life in the valley of the shadow of death. King also became increasingly unpopular, especially when he spoke out for peace. Peace and justice are twins in the Bible. They belong together. And yeah, there he was recognizing that he couldn't just be a civil rights leader. He couldn't be this one who was a pastor on Sunday and a leader in the civil rights movement on Monday and Tuesday, unless he spoke out against the war and pointed out that then, as now, the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He also got more and more outspoken about injustice relating to money. He saw 3 great enemies: racism, poverty, and militarism, that were keeping our society from becoming the beloved society, the just society, the one that the founding fathers hinted at but didn't fulfill with their life, the one that the Civil War should have solved but didn't. He was one who chose both the rhetoric of the Bible and the rhetoric of what America should and could be to remind us that we need a society free from war. We need a society in which there's not great difference in income, and a society that is committed to peace. He lived a strong and wonderful life doing that. But as we know, the days got rougher and rougher. He went north to Chicago, and he ran into stuff that he never ran into in the South. HBO has a documentary about those last 3 years. And maybe in the whole scheme of things, it was merciful that his life ended when he was 39, because things were going so poorly in so many ways. But he had been to the mountaintop, he had seen the promised land, and he pointed up to a lot of us to remind us to indeed try and make that happen, the beloved community here and now. When I first started planning this service, I felt a little lonely and recognized that, well, a lot of people wondered why go to a lot of efforts to do such a thing. But I felt a lot less lonely yesterday when I came across the information on this handout that I believe all of you have gotten. Because the National Council of Churches, an ecumenical council that represents about 38 million Christians, along with allies from interfaith groups and other religious traditions, are getting it, I hope, really serious about what needs to be done. And if you'll look on the handout, there are 3 words in boldface: that we should awaken ourselves, that the truth of racism is ever present, deeply rooted in American culture, and profoundly damaging to our communities. Secondly, we should confront racism, speaking truth to ourselves, our communities, and institutions, and stand against injustice. And 3, transform the hearts, minds, and behavior of the people and structures that shape society. Another one of the speakers at the march in Washington was the Reverend Eugene Carson Blake, who was a leader in the Presbyterian Church and in the National Council of Churches. And what he said was, if all of his constituency and the Jewish people who were there and the Unitarians who were there and the other Christians who were there had lived up to their doctrines, their beliefs, there would have been no need for that march. But it was necessary, and marches are still necessary today. But as we reflect on the life of Martin Luther King, let's recognize that his courage, his boldness as a follower of his understanding of God working in this world makes it possible for us to be fellow dreamers, dreamers who recognize that we should recognize a child of God in everyone. Not just those who are like us, not just those who are in our class or whatever, but to everyone. And in recognizing that, we should be agents of love and peace and those wonderful words that one finds in the Beatitudes. One of King's most famous sermons was often called the Drum Major Sermon, and it was one that he actually talked about what should happen at his funeral. And he said, please don't do this, please don't do that. But then he included these words. I'd like you to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others, that he tried to love someone, tried to be right on the war question, did try to feed the hungry, did try to clothe those who were naked, to visit those who were in prison. If you want to say that I was a drum major, say I was a drum major for justice, for peace, for righteousness. I want to be with Jesus in love and in justice, and in truth and in commitment to others, so that we can make our old world a new world. As we reflect on the life of King, may we be part of making it more a new world, a world in which people are treated with love and respect and dignity, and the ugly violence that has so shattered our national life can end. In Jesus' name, amen.